2 of each kind on board the ark. He didn't have to bring 2 of every variety, just 2 of each kind, and he probably brought babies. He was smart enough to figure that out. Just be sure to get a pink one and a blue one. And then after the flood, I think the dinosaurs died off because of the climate change and people killing them, calling them dragons back in those days. And I cover all that in my seminars on dinosaurs and how they fit right into the Bible and how there might be a few stragglers still alive today, which is why there have been so many sightings like Loch Ness Monster type thing like that. The Bible says the animals are going to bring forth after their kind, not species. Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, is not the argument. By the way, he never does discuss the origin of species in The Origin of Species, but the origin of kinds would be the argument. The Bible says they bring forth after their kind. God told Noah to bring 2 of every sort onto the ark. For instance, today there are 250 varieties of dogs in the world. I was asked to come speak at this college in Boston one time. They said I could do a speak on creation if their teachers could ask me any questions they wanted. So I got my timelines out, and there were 6 professors and all their students in the room. As far as I could tell, all of them believed in evolution. And I got my charts out, and I said, folks, I believe that about 6,000 years ago, God created everything. 4,400 years ago, there was a flood, destroyed the world. Noah saved 2 of each kind on board the ark. And then I shared with them what they believe. 20 billion years ago, there was a big bang. This is in just about every textbook there is. I mean, I can show it to you in 100 of them if you'd like. And then 4.6 billion years ago, the earth cooled down and formed a hard, rocky crust. And it rained on these rocks for millions of years. This textbook says, as earth formed, the surface was similar to the moon today. The surface was hot and there were large pools of bubbling lava. But it rained on the rocks for millions of years and formed oceans. This is what the textbooks teach the kids. Millions of years of torrential rains created great oceans. And in these oceans was a swirling broth of complex chemicals. Progress from a complex chemical soup to a living organism is very slow. Yes, it is. Totally stopped. Doesn't happen at all. That's how slow it is. Well, one of the professors in the crowd was getting really upset about that time, and he said, Mr. Hovind, there are 250 varieties of dogs in the world today. I said, I never counted them, but I'll believe you. He said, you think all those dogs came from 2 dogs off of Noah's Ark? I said, sir, would you look at what you're teaching your students? You're teaching your students that all the dogs in the world today came from a rock. One lady was so angry after this, she says, we do not believe we came from a rock. I said, well, where do you think you came from? She said, we came from a macromolecule. I said, where did that come from? She said, well, from the oceans. There's minerals in the oceans. I said, where did those minerals come from? She said, well, it rained on the rocks for millions of years, and it finally dawned on her, wow, I do believe we came from a rock, don't I? I don't care if you want to believe that. Honestly, that's fine. But don't call it science. That's not science. That's a fairy tale. Textbook says humans evolved from bacteria 4 billion years ago. This one shows the kids a starfish and says 3.4 billion years old, the remains of the early ancestors of modern human beings. Now look, you're welcome to believe that, but don't call it science. That's part of a religion. This textbook shows the kids a tarsier and says 30 million years ago these creatures evolved. Now folks, that word evolved right there, that has 2 different meanings, and the entire argument today and every other day on this topic is over the 2 different meanings of the word evolution. And we'll cover that in just a second. But if you straighten out what that word means, the argument is over. One meaning of the word is indeed scientific, no question, and the other meaning is indeed religious, with no evidence to support it. But the textbook says we've got evidence for evolution. I mean, kids are taught whole chapters, sometimes whole units, just on this topic. Sometimes entire courses at college are devoted to the evolution philosophy. What happened in the early 1800s, some guys got together, primarily Charles Lyell, who wrote this book, but building on the work of Stratus Smith and Steno and Cuvier and some other guys, they developed the geologic column. They said each of the layers of the earth is a different age. This was all done in the early 1800s. Each of those layers was assigned an age way before there ever was any carbon dating, potassium argon dating, rubidium strontium dating, lead 208 lead dating, long before any radiometric dating. The layers were assigned an age based upon the assumption that evolution has happened. It all is based on evolution assumption, and that's how the geologic column got started. Now, there were some creationists involved in that who thought that maybe God created the world many times, multiple creations. Well, they're simply wrong. But all of this geologic column is based on circular reasoning. This textbook shows on page 306 that they date the rocks by the fossils. On the next page, it says you date the fossils by the rocks. And this happens all through. The geologic column, like this textbook says, if there were a column of sediments, unfortunately no such column exists. The geologic column only exists in the textbook, and it's all based on the circular reasoning. That's how things are dated. The intelligent layman has long suspected circular reasoning in the use of rocks to date fossils and fossils to date rocks. The geologist has never bothered to think of a good reply, feeling the results explanations are not worth the trouble as long as the work brings results. They know it's based on circular reasoning. But those layers cannot be different ages. I can show you hundreds of pictures if you want to take the time of petrified trees standing up, running through multiple layers of rock strata. The tree did not stand there for millions of years, and it didn't grow through hundreds of feet of solid rock looking for sunlight. It was formed during a worldwide flood. The flood formed those layers. But this fella, Charles Darwin, the author of this book, set sail on board the Beagle in 1831. He was going to sail around for 5 years. He brought with the book by Charles Lyell. That book destroyed his confidence in the Bible. Darwin came back a skeptic, a scoffer. After 30 years of coaching by Charles Lyell, Darwin finally wrote his book, Origin of Species, which has a much longer title, by the way, we can get into later. And that book changed Darwin's life for good. Later, he claimed to be an atheist. As Charlie sailed around the coast of South America, he came to Ecuador, the islands of Ecuador, called the Galapagos Islands, right here. There on these islands, Charlie observed there are 14 varieties of finches. He studied the birds carefully. They all had different beak shapes. Some were bigger than others. They were all finches, but different kinds of finches. Charlie studied them for quite a while, collected quite a huge number of them, and said, you know what? I think all of these birds had a common ancestor. I bet you're right, Charlie. A bird. And then he said, maybe this proves that birds are related to bananas. What? No. Page 170 of his book, he said all forms of life on earth, all plants, all animals have a common ancestor. Page 170. What he saw is what we sometimes call microevolution. Now this is the entire debate right here. Microevolution is one meaning of the word, which is basically saying that dogs produce a variety of dogs, roses produce a variety of roses. Nobody argues with that. Microevolution is a fact. It is scientific. It is observable. That's what farmers do for a living. They try to make that happen. They try to get a better species of whatever they're raising for their area. And the animals do have a wide range of adaptations they can take on. But these adaptations have limits. Farmers have been trying to get bigger and bigger pigs for a long time, but they'll never get a pig as big as Texas. There's a limit in there someplace. Roaches eventually become resistant to pesticides, no question about that, but there's a limit. Two things you need to understand. The resistance to the pesticide was already in the roach population, maybe just a small percentage of it, and when you do end up with a resistant population of roaches, you're swimming in the shallow end of the gene pool now for the roaches. Next thing you need to understand, there's a limit to this resistance. They might become resistant to these pesticides, but they will never become resistant to a sledgehammer. So, yes, there's variations, no question, I agree, that happens. But what happens then is the professors try to make the students see thousands of examples of microevolution, which is indeed a science. And they try to make them make a giant leap of faith and logic into believing that that somehow magically is evidence for macroevolution. Macroevolution says all life forms have a common ancestor. The dog and the rose are related, ultimately, to a rock. Now, macroevolution is a religion. This is assumed. It has